That look said it all. No beating around the bush, no masks. You felt it. Someone else did too. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't imagination. The truth that has always been there but was never spoken is now laid bare. Yes, there are feelings. There always have been. And now, you can pretend that nothing happened. You can go on with your life as if that moment didn't change everything. But something inside you already knows that's not possible. Because now the silence feels different. The absence carries a meaning it didn't have before. Every detail that would have gone unnoticed is now a reminder that something is there. Something that was never said but has always been present. Someone looked at you like they were seeing something they've always wanted, but never had the courage to admit. Like someone who knows it's too late to pretend, but too early to know what to do next. A gaze filled with unspoken words, interrupted desires, and possibilities that slipped away. And you felt it. You felt it because you always knew. You didn't need words. You didn't need proof. It was always there, in the small gestures, in the interrupted conversations, in the moments when the world around you seemed insignificant compared to what was happening between you. But now, you can no longer ignore it. You can no longer pretend that look didn't change everything. Because it did. You notice it in the way time seems different since then. Like something has been paused, like everything around you has slowed down. A part of you tries to move on as if nothing happened, but another part knows that something has been revealed, something that was always there but never acknowledged. And now, what do you do when you finally see the truth? Maybe it's easier to ignore it, to pretend it was just any moment, a coincidence without meaning. But is it really possible? Because since then, every detail seems to carry a different weight. Every word spoken holds something more. Every silence becomes a space filled with meanings that weren't there before. The truth is, after that look, everything changed. And what happens now depends on you. But ignoring it isn't as simple as it seems, is it? You can try. You can pretend it was just in your head, that that instant meant nothing more than a coincidence. You can move on, keeping everything the way it's always been. But is that really possible? Because now every time someone says your name, your mind pauses, waiting to hear the voice of someone who shouldn't be so present anymore. Every time you see a gaze wandering through the room, your heart races, as if it's hoping to find that same look again. And when you close your eyes for just a second longer, the face that emerges in your memory is always the same. So, you might want to forget. But forgetting doesn't happen just because you decide to. And the worst part? Someone else knows that too. Because that look wasn't just yours. It was a shared moment, a second when two people saw the same thing, felt the same weight, understood the same truth. It was a moment when time stopped, leaving only what had always existed, but had never been said. Now, there are questions that were never asked but hang in the air waiting for answers. What happens when something so silent screams so loudly? How long can a feeling be suffocated before it finds a way to escape? And when it finally escapes, what do you do with it? Maybe it's easier to ignore, to keep smiling politely, talking about things that don't matter, acting as if nothing happened. Maybe it's more comfortable to pretend that look was just a mistake. But between pretending and forgetting, there's an abyss. Because forgetting means that moment held no significance. And you know it did. You know that since then, any distance feels longer, any silence feels heavier, any simple gesture carries a weight that it didn't have before. Because now when someone looks at you, no gaze compares to that one. And someone feels the same. You notice it in the small details. In the way glances try to avoid crossing paths but fail. In the hesitation before speaking. In the way steps slow down as the path draws near. In the presence that once felt light, but now carries an impossible weight to ignore. What used to be natural is now a minefield. Every conversation seems to have an invisible limit, a barrier that can't be crossed. Yet at the same time, all that was contained in that gaze is still there, waiting. And you know it. Someone else does too. So what to do now? Pretend it never happened? Try to bury what was seen? Or accept that after that moment, there's no turning back? You can choose to ignore, but will anyone else? Ignoring seems like the safest option, the easiest, the most convenient. But the truth is, deep down, you've realized This isn't just going to disappear, because now everything has changed. The routine goes on. People talk, days pass, the world keeps spinning. But inside you, there's something different. There's an unease, an expectation, a new weight that you don't know where to place. And the worst part? Someone else feels it too. You notice it in the details, in the small slips when trying to seem indifferent, in the way someone takes a deep breath before speaking, as if gathering strength to act naturally, in the way glances avoid crossing, yet always end up meeting in the reflection of a window, in the shadow of a hallway, in the moment when no one is paying attention. The silence now speaks louder than any word spoken, and that's what makes everything harder. If only it were just a doubt, if only there were room for uncertainty, maybe it would be easier to pretend. But there isn't. The truth has already been laid bare. You've seen it, you've felt it, you know it. Now what remains is what to do with it. Perhaps at another time, this reality wouldn't change anything. But now it changes everything. You feel it in the absence, in the void someone leaves when they're not around, in the way the longing weighs differently than it did before, in how any presence becomes insignificant compared to that one, and someone feels the same. You notice in the way everything seems contained, as if there's something trapped in the middle of the words, something that wants to come out but cannot. But for how long? Because the truth is this. Feelings can be ignored for a while. They can be suffocated. They can be locked away behind a gaze that feigns indifference, but they don't disappear. They grow. And when they grow too much, they find a way to escape. So how much longer until this truth becomes impossible to hide? How long until what has been seen becomes impossible to deny? And when that moment comes, when the gaze is stronger than any choice to pretend that nothing is wrong, what happens next? You can keep ignoring it, but will anyone else? If suddenly this barrier of silence is broken, if at some unexpected moment the gaze is stronger than the fear, than the doubt, than this attempt at control, because holding on to a feeling like this for so long is exhausting. It's exhausting to flee from your own thoughts. It's exhausting to avoid the looks that have already said everything. It's exhausting to act like nothing is different when, in reality, everything has changed. And when the exhaustion of pretending becomes greater than the fear of feeling. Maybe it will happen in a mundane moment, an instant without warning, without planning. A distraction, an unconscious gesture, a slip that makes everything overflow, because feelings do not disappear. They wait. They wait for the right moment to explode, to find a crack, to become bigger than any effort to contain them. And then what happens? What happens when, in the middle of any conversation, the voice falters, the gaze wavers, and the silence becomes too heavy? When the heart races without warning and the breathing becomes a little shorter, a little more unstable? When an accidental touch lingers a second longer than it should, conveying everything that words can't express? You feel it, and someone else feels it too. Because it's not just the gaze that reveals, it's the pauses between words, it's the interrupted gestures, it's the choices that seem small but carry deep meanings. It's the path someone chooses to take, always passing close by, always staying nearby, even without reason. And then the question becomes inevitable. How much longer until someone can no longer hold on? Until what has been suffocated breaks free in a moment of courage or weakness? Until the gaze becomes impossible to look away from? Until a wrong word or an overly long silence reveals everything at once? Because sooner or later it will happen. And what will you do when that moment arrives? When what has been seen is finally spoken? Are you ready? And is someone else? What if no one is ready? What if the moment comes without warning, without permission, without control? Because feelings don't wait for convenience. They don't ask for permission to exist. And one day the silence will break. Maybe it's in a conversation that should be about something else, but suddenly takes a different tone. Maybe it's in a gaze that lingers too long, long enough for everything to be understood without the need for words. Or maybe there's no longer room for a middle ground. Maybe the truth simply slips out, in an unplanned outburst, in a confession that wasn't anticipated, in a touch that happens because words are no longer enough. And what happens after that? Because when that moment arrives, there's no turning back. You might try to ease it, retreat, pretend it meant nothing, But it's already too late. What was contained is now exposed. What was suffocated is now free. And someone will react, perhaps with relief, perhaps with fear, perhaps with denial, but not with indifference, because no one walks away unscathed from a truth like this. So, what happens when the gazes meet and neither one looks away? When the space between you becomes too small for all the unspoken things? When the breath quickens and the heart beats too hard to disguise? What happens when there are no more excuses? Because you might be afraid. Someone else might be too. But now that everything is clear, choosing to ignore will be even more difficult than admitting. And then, what will you do? What will someone do? And above all, what can still be avoided before it's too late? Because even if nothing has been said, everything has already been understood. The gaze that lingered too long, the silence that stretched beyond necessity, the touch that happened without intention, but remained in memory. And now? Now, every choice carries more weight. Every word requires care. Every distance seems like a decision. And the problem is that avoiding is also a type of response. If someone retreats, it means they felt something. If they hesitate, it means they fear what they already know. If they pretend to be indifferent, it means they care too much. So, where does this lead? Because continuing to pretend nothing happened takes a toll. It requires a control that slips through the fingers. It requires a resistance that sooner or later will give way. And when will it give way? When the barrier is too low to hold back what's behind it. What happens when someone can no longer hide? Maybe it's on an ordinary night, in a goodbye that lasts too long. Maybe it's in a brief reunion, in a moment when the heart races even before any words are spoken. Or maybe it's in a moment of carelessness, a glance that reveals, a gesture that betrays, a sigh that exposes what has been there all along. So, what happens? What occurs when the inevitable finally happens? Because feelings can be postponed. They can be controlled, they can be suppressed for a time, but they don't disappear. And someone knows this as well as you do. And when that moment comes, when the inevitable becomes real, what will be done with that truth? Because now it's no longer about imagining, it's no longer about assumptions. Now it's about dealing with what is already in front of you. And dealing with it means confronting the only question that matters: what to do now. You can retreat. Someone else can too. Pretend nothing happened, push that feeling into some hidden corner. Hope that time will erase what has been seen. But does time really erase? Or does it merely deepen everything, make it more latent, more intense? Because if it were possible to forget, it would have happened by now. If it were possible to erase, that look wouldn't have left scars. And the truth is that trying to ignore it only makes everything more intense. So what comes next? The discomfort of denial? The tension of avoiding something that can't be avoided? The attempt to go on as if nothing has changed, when, in reality, everything is different? Or does surrender come? The acceptance that no matter how hard you fight against it, this feeling isn't going away. Because at this point, there are no more doubts. There's no more room to pretend it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a meaningless moment. It was real. It is real. And now that everything has been exposed, it's a matter of time before it has to be confronted. The question is, when that happens, will you be ready? And will anyone else be? Now there are no more doubts. What was once just a suppressed feeling, a repressed look, is now an impossible truth to ignore. You felt it. Someone else did too. And what happens next depends on a choice. It could be fear, it could be insecurity, it could be the anxiety of taking risks and not knowing what comes next. But the truth is already there. What you saw, what you felt, cannot be undone. So how much longer until everything is said? Until the distance becomes unbearable, until the silence hurts more than uncertainty, because ignoring a feeling doesn't make it disappear. It only postpones the inevitable. And the only question that remains is, when the moment comes, what will you do? Now it's your turn. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt that a glance said more than 1,000 words? Share your experience here, let's talk about it. And if this message resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.